Have you ever heard the story of two brothers, born to the same father but raised in very different worlds? One brother stayed home, the other was sent away into the desert. One grew up with favor, the other with survival. Their names? Ishmael and Isaac. Their father? A man named Abraham, the same Abraham that billions of people today call their spiritual father. But here's where the story gets interesting, and honestly, kind of sad, because these two brothers didn't just grow up and live normal lives. They became the fathers of two nations, two peoples, two faiths, and for thousands of years their descendants have lived in conflict. But what really happened? Was Ishmael rejected by God? Was Isaac the only one loved? And what does the Bible actually say about their relationship? A lot of people think Arabs and Jews are natural enemies. But is that what God intended? Or did something break along the way? In this video, we're going to go back to the beginning, back to the dusty tents of Abraham, the tears of a young mother in the wilderness, and the soft voice of God that spoke to both her sons. Because once you understand the truth behind the Ishmaelites, you'll see that this story isn't just about history, it's about healing. Let's start at the very beginning. A long, long time ago, there was a man named Abraham. He lived in tents, far from cities, and walked through deserts with his flocks and his faith. He didn't have a Bible, he didn't have a church, but he had something even more powerful, a promise from God. God told Abraham, "I will make you the father of many nations. Look up at the stars. Your children will be as many as those." It was a beautiful promise, but there was a problem. Abraham had no children, and he wasn't young. His wife Sarah was very old too. She had never been able to have a baby, and now it seemed impossible. So they waited and waited and waited some more, but the baby never came. One day Sarah had an idea, a desperate one. She said to Abraham, "Take my servant Hagar and have a child with her. Maybe that's how God will give us a son." It wasn't the way God had planned it, but Abraham agreed. And soon, Hagar became pregnant. This was no ordinary pregnancy. It was filled with tension, jealousy, and pain. Sarah felt bitter. Hagar felt proud. And Abraham was caught in the middle. But when the baby was born, he was loved. They named him Ishmael, which means God hears. And truly, God did hear. He saw Hagar, a servant girl, crying in the desert. He saw her pain, and he promised her that Ishmael would also become a great nation. For years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son. He ran through the camp, laughed with his father, and learned the ways of the desert. But then, something impossible happened. Sarah became pregnant. It was a miracle. And when she gave birth, they named the baby Isaac, which means laughter, because Sarah had laughed when God first told her she would have a son. And now, she was laughing with joy. Two boys, two sons of Abraham, one from a servant, one from a promise. They shared the same father, the same land, even the same sun above their heads. But everything else was about to be different. This is where the story begins to split, not just in their lives, but in history itself. Because these two boys would grow into two very different men, and their children would one day become two very different nations. But before we go there, we have to understand this. Both were sons, both were loved, even if the world treated them differently, even if history remembers them with conflict. God never forgot either of them. Some people think that once Isaac was born, Ishmael no longer mattered, like he was just a mistake, a side story, someone who didn't belong. But that's not true at all. God never forgets people, especially not ones who are hurting. When Sarah told Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, it broke his heart. This was his son, his flesh and blood. He had raised him, laughed with him, and watched him grow. Abraham didn't want to let go, but God told him something strange and beautiful. He said, "Do what Sarah asks. I will take care of the boy. I will make him into a great nation." God was saying, "I'm not done with Ishmael." So early in the morning, Abraham gave Hagar some bread and water, and they walked off into the desert. alone. The sun was hot. The water ran out, and Hagar laid her son under a bush so she wouldn't have to watch him die. She walked away and cried, but God heard her tears, and he heard the cries of the boy too. Then something amazing happened. An angel of God called out to her, "Hagar, don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. Lift him up. I will make him into a great nation." At that moment, a well appeared. Water in the middle of the desert. Hagar and Ishmael lived, and they didn't just survive, they thrived. The Bible says Ishmael became a skilled archer. He lived in the desert of Paran and married an Egyptian woman. He had 12 sons, just like Jacob later would. God kept his promise. Ishmael's name means God hears, and God truly did. He didn't erase Ishmael from the story. He gave him a legacy, a future. So even though Isaac carried the covenant, Ishmael carried something too, a blessing. Before there were nations, before the arguments and wars, there were two women. One was named Sarah, the other Hagar. They lived in the same tent, but not in the same heart. Because even though they were both connected to Abraham, they carried very different feelings inside. Sarah was the wife, Hagar was the servant. And when Hagar became pregnant with Abraham's child, something in Sarah broke. She felt small, she felt angry, she felt left out of her own story. And Hagar, she began to feel something too. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was pain, maybe both. The Bible says Hagar began to look down on Sarah, and Sarah became so bitter she mistreated Hagar. So Hagar ran away. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have food, just fear and tears. That's when God stepped in. In the quiet of the desert, a voice called her name. "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going?" God sent an angel, not to punish her, but to comfort her. He told her to go back, to be patient. And then he made her a promise. "Your son will be strong. His descendants will be too many to count." Years later, after Isaac was born, the tension returned. Sarah saw Ishmael laughing during a feast for Isaac. Maybe it was harmless, maybe it wasn't, but to Sarah, it felt like a threat. She turned to Abraham and said, "Send that woman and her son away. He will not share in the inheritance with my son." It wasn't just jealousy now, it was fear. Fear that Ishmael would take Isaac's place. And so, the final break happened. Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away. And from that moment forward, the house of Abraham had been split, not by swords, but by jealousy, pain, and fear. That's where the conflict began. Not between Arabs and Jews, but between two women, two mothers, and a father torn in two. After Hagar and Ishmael were sent away, they didn't return. They walked deeper into the wilderness, away from the tents, away from Abraham and away from Isaac, but not away from God. The Bible says they settled in the desert of Paran, a dry, wild land. It wasn't soft or comfortable, but it became home, and Ishmael, the boy once crying under a bush, began to grow strong. He learned how to survive, how to hunt, how to shoot a bow and protect his family. He wasn't raised with fine things. He was raised by the wind, the sun, and the dust. As he became a man, God's promise began to bloom. Ishmael had 12 sons, just like his younger relative Jacob would one day have. These sons became 12 princes, leaders of tribes and fathers of peoples. They spread across the deserts and mountains, building families and communities. They were known for their strength, their courage, and their spirit of independence. Some of the tribes that came from Ishmael, like Kedar and Nebaioth, are even mentioned later in the Bible, known for their herds, their trade, and their wisdom. Many people believe these tribes became the ancestors of the Arab nations, that through Ishmael's line, people settled across Arabia, a region that would later become home to mighty empires and the birthplace of Islam. This means that millions of people today trace their spiritual and ancestral roots back to Ishmael, not as a mistake, not as a forgotten son, but as a father of nations, just like God promised. And even now, thousands of years later, that legacy still echoes across deserts, in names, in stories, and in hearts. Ishmael didn't carry the covenant, but he carried a promise. And that promise was not small. It shaped history. While Ishmael's story continued in the desert, Isaac stayed near home. He grew up under Abraham's care, with Sarah watching closely. Isaac was more than just a miracle baby. He was the child of the promise. Remember, God told Abraham that his descendants would bless the whole world. That promise didn't pass through Ishmael. It passed through Isaac. And when Isaac grew older, he had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was the firstborn, strong, hairy, and a skilled hunter. But it was Jacob, the younger one, who would carry the covenant. One night, something strange happened to Jacob. He fell asleep in the desert, using a stone as a pillow. In his dream, he saw a ladder reaching up to heaven, with angels going up and down. And God stood above it and said, "I am the Lord. I will give you and your descendants this land, and through you all people on earth will be blessed." When Jacob woke up, everything changed. Later, God gave him a new name, Israel. From Jacob, now Israel, came 12 sons. Each one became the father of a tribe. The 12 tribes of Israel, they became the Jewish people. This was the line that would one day lead to Moses and King David and the prophets, and eventually, Jesus. God wasn't playing favorites, but he had chosen this family to carry a message to the world, that he is real, he is good, and he keeps his promises. Through Isaac's line, we see the beginning of a people who would suffer, grow, wander, return, and still survive, all while carrying the light of God through history. The covenant was never about power, it was about purpose. Isaac's line was chosen to be a light, but that doesn't mean the others were forgotten. It simply means God had a plan that started with Abraham, continued through Isaac, and still echoes today.